Hello, my name is Jim Porter, and this channel that you're watching is called Skeptical Spectrum. I invented this channel to get more clear-headedness in the way I think and all that stuff. And the way I think you do that is you try to figure out things and use as much actual logic and reason as you can. And then you get in touch with other people's opposing arguments and their opposing beliefs. And I think this sharpens us. And actually, it's probably one of the best ways for humans to truly get along. I believe people should talk politics with their friends and their family. And that is the sign that you've matured into a grown up relationship. So today's talk is about morality, and I'm going to take the controversial position that there is no, I don't know if it's controversial, it's inherently controversial if there's disagreement, but I'm saying I'm going to take the position that there is no objective morality. So please subscribe. That's basically all I want you to do. I think it'll be good to see more subscribers on there. And then eventually, after a certain amount, I'll try to monetize my channel and make my videos much better. That's for later. But right now, I want to talk about morality. So, to begin with, I'm taking the position that morality is fake and real. A lot of people think that morality is objective, that there are some things that are simply objectively right or wrong. In fact, everyone believes this, even me. But I'm here to tell you that we are wrong. Morality is 100% subjective. It's made up, it's a fiction. But I will never, ever truly believe that, even though it's true. However, understanding on an intellectual level that morality is made up will help humans make life better for every living thing. That's all of us plus all the animals, and for all we know, it'll be better for all the plants. So we are material things. An assumption about this video, the assumption I want you to understand is that this video is grounded in a materialist assumption. It is the assumption that all of reality comes down to physical material and physical forces. Currently, this framework does not take into account a God, a soul, an afterlife, or any of that. It purports to explain everything we see and know without needing any supernatural explanations at all. I currently agree with the materialist point of view, and maybe I won't one day, but I haven't seen, in fact, I used to believe in the supernatural, and now I have no ability to believe in it right now. Discussions about the existence of supernatural things will be saved for other videos. This video explains how morality is still necessary and real in its own way, even though it was created by the possibly non-intelligent, non-purposeful process of evolution. Also non-personal, by the way. That's not intended to be a dig. So morality is subjective, but it's not subjective. I say, but it's not as a caution because our emotions will not let us feel like morality is subjective, even though it is. And if we fight our emotions too much, we suppress them. This can lead to numbness, depression, shutdown, and very disturbing feelings like that feeling of going to a dark place. So we often have to pretend to believe like our morality is objective. Morality has survival value, and sometimes it feels like a life or death impulse. Sometimes your moral reactivity forces you into action during an emergency. Your body uses very strong emotions to sometimes control your thoughts and behaviors, but often your brain makes you feel like there is an emergency when there isn't one. You cannot control yourself under situations of extremely strong emotions, or you can control yourself, but it can be very difficult to do so. Some examples of extremely strong emotions are disgust and terror, but there is also righteous indignation and sexual desire. Strong, driving emotions can be painful or pleasurable. Emotions and thoughts are physical things. Everything you think and feel happens in the body. Notice the similarity between the words emotions, motion, and motivation. 1, 2, 3. Emotions get you to feel like doing things, and sometimes they just force you to move. According to the research of Lisa Feldman Barrett, the sensations, the feelings you feel when you are noticing your emotions are the neurochemical processes in your body that relegate fuel from storage to parts of your body that are necessary for an upcoming task. Cognitions contain the content, images, text, sounds, or an integrated abstract concept about what you're about to do or what you're about to be dealing with. Together, the sensation and concepts constitute what you'll experience as an emotion. For example, if you're walking in a parking lot and a speeding car nearly runs you over, you are going to have some strong sensations and perhaps some powerful images about what you're going to do in response. Either way, these are not completely under your control. Please remember that pleasure is a moral guide. Pleasure is a moral guide. Pleasure is morality. Some emotions are pleasurable, some are painful. People generally tend to put morality and pleasure in opposite categories. I'm here to argue that that is wrong. Here's one reason we've fallen into this misconception. We seek pleasure and avoid pain. That's what we do. But experience tells us that it's impossible to always provide ourselves pleasure. Our biological capacity for pleasure is finite. If we exhaust it, we feel discomfort or pain. Confusion about this phenomenon has caused our ancestors to reason that we are being punished for seeking our own pleasure, when it's really just a biological side effect. So we have to become very savvy at managing our pleasure and coping with inevitable pain. We can learn to budget our pleasure. It's like budgeting money. When people spend money thoughtlessly on what they find pleasurable, they may run out of money sooner and have a more difficult time buying things and experiences that provide pleasure. Drugs are similar to money. When you use drugs, you not only can run out of those drugs sooner and thereby accidentally deplete your pleasure resources, which are the drugs, but you can also mess up the processes in your body that allow you to respond with pleasure to those drugs, thereby depleting your pleasure capacity for a time inside until you recover bodily. To recover, you may have to deprive yourself for a time of pleasure. Now, think of the chemicals your body makes. Those are drugs. Let's call some of those internally produced drugs joy juices. Your body makes and stores different kinds of joy juices or uses them immediately upon manufacturing them. They are a finite resource and need to be resynthesized over and over again. When you do something that gives you pleasure, you use some of your joy juice. For example, riding a roller coaster is fun, but if you get a free ride on that roller coaster over and over again without having to wait in line, you will eventually stop feeling the thrill. Pretty soon you could become bored, an emotion that is considered a displeasure. Even eventually you could burn out and get depressed just from using up too much of your joy juice. Depression is famously a form of deep suffering. Now, a note is that this burnout style of depression is not the same thing as the other kinds of persistent severe depression. So anyway, that's why people talk about pleasure as if it's sinful, because not being careful with your pleasure balance can cause you pain. That's why humans create morals. It's a framework for optimizing pleasure, but we don't admit that because we're not even conscious that that's what it's about. Even with that, though, morals could probably not exist at all if humans were not social by nature. To break apart into components the usefulness of manufacturing morals and a social species, I will use the terms primary morality, secondary morality, and complex morality, which I manufactured. Primary morality is based on seeking pleasure and avoiding pain for yourself. It's about a primary recipient, you, and a primary or a proximal source, you. Seeking to provide ourselves with our own pleasure gets us doing many survival and reproductive behaviors, like screwing and eating. Secondary morality is the pleasure and pain you feel at seeing other people's predicaments. Righteous indignation is a pleasurable feeling, even though it is a response to seeing other people suffering. It juices us up to right wrongs, protect others, or berate someone for having different moral views than ours. It's about a primary recipient, you, and a proximal source, you again. Being holier than thou can feel very good. A sense of purpose really gives people an apparent reason to live. That has survival value right there. Complex morality is about putting coins in the social bank. It's a protection racket, but a natural made protection racket. It's how you earn protection from the group and loyalty and stuff like that. Acceptance in the group feels really good and could save your life. Rejection and even indifference by the group can mean lack of protection and can really leave your life at risk. Complex morality is also about avoiding the absolute wrath of the group. The group can turn on you. The evolutionary process has constructed you to be very, very worried about that. Complex morality is complex because getting yourself pleasure can sometimes rub other individuals or the group as a collective the wrong way. This is the big one. If you don't get yourself some pleasure, you're not going to tolerate it well for long. If you don't give people some pleasure, or if you give them enough of the opposite, they're not going to tolerate you for long. This has been going on for a long enough time that social species like us have been organizing ways of treating each other. That It's now developed into our specific species way of creating moral codes. We've even gone up a level. It's gotten to the point where it's not just how we treat each other as individuals, but how we treat the group as a whole and how the group treats us. The group becomes, in our minds, its own conscious entity, like a living thing. Complex morality is also called complex because there isn't just one human group. Human evolution really occurred when the earth wasn't so crowded with humans and other hominids. We existed in separate, smaller groups that were more spread apart. That's how we got the trait concept of in-group and out-group selected into us. The environmental pressure to differentiate from out-groups and identify with in-groups really was very powerful back then. This leads me to discuss one of the most powerfully morality-related emotions that exists among human beings. It's called disgust. So, discussing disgust. Because long ago we lived in separate, small communities spread further apart from each other than they are now, we had a protection against a killer that could have wiped out human beings before we became the populous, earth consuming locusts we seem to be today. That killer was disease. The emotion associated with avoiding disease is disgust. Whenever you hear someone acting racist, overly tribal, exclusive, or even genocidal, you are dealing with their emotion of disgust. It's so powerful because disgust saved lives. And that's how it allowed itself as a trait emotion to reproduce because humans who didn't have the capacity to feel disgust for other human beings or other human groups would not instinctively distance themselves and thereby protect themselves. They didn't have science, they didn't have microscopes. All they had was disgust and the cognitive justifications for it. The enemy was invisible and their explanations were superstitious, but they kept their distance and prevented germ spread. They committed atrocities, some of which were exactly what was needed to prevent the spread of infection, even though they didn't know there was an infection to spread. Burning witches, ostracizing people who behaved weirdly, those behaviors could by chance prevent the spread of disease. Of course, we couldn't do that to people without disgust. Without disgust, our desire to be near others and to be accepted and get all the joy juice from bonding with them is too much of a draw to allow us to harm another human. You could not crucify a fellow human or mete out genocide were it not for the feeling of disgust to override the feelings of human affiliation. And sometimes, unfortunately, that proliferates itself because it provides survival value. So my thesis, my thesis here is that disgust is a primary, perhaps the primary emotion that causes us to believe that morality is objective. By the way, I understand that there are other emotions just as powerful as disgust, but still, we see people doing something and we feel so disgusted that there's no chance we will tolerate it. But a cursory look across the globe shows us that something that I think is disgusting and abhorrent and vile is another culture's way of avoiding what they feel to be sickening, detestable, and awful. And here's a trigger warning. I'm going to hint at a practice in this next paragraph that could truly be traumatizing to hear about. Even though I only hint at it, those of you who know what I'm talking about when you hear the hints about it could be vulnerable to flashback or other trauma response. So here's the sensitive content. I want to give everybody a little bit of time to decide if they want to listen. The sensitive content is coming now. To some cultures, the idea of a woman pleasuring themselves sexually is unthinkable. This can come from having a gendered purity culture. Note that purity is also associated with sterility, cleanliness, and a germ free environment. The specter of disease is behind most of our feelings of moral objectivity. The desire of the people of these cultures to protect themselves from the feelings of repulsion they experience when they think of girls deviating from sexual purity results in them taking an action that I and people of my culture believe to be heinous, unacceptable, and diabolical. I think you know what I might be talking about. This concludes the section of the discussion that I think could be psychologically triggering to some viewers. These feelings that they and we experience are not a choice. They just developed this way. Our ways became disgusting to them, and their ways are disgusting to us, making it profoundly difficult to even consider a dialogue on the topic. I would say prohibitively difficult most of the time. This is why morality seems so absolute, even though it isn't. Their history and environment contrasted to mine shaped these differences in our moral rules. But I do not believe that people should lay their feelings aside and try to override their emotions to come to a meeting of minds with each other. You will develop mental illness in one form or another if you try such a thing. Morality is not absolute, but it doesn't work if we don't allow ourselves to believe, at least emotionally, that it is absolute. But simultaneously, we can use our cognitive social process to analyze and debate the elements of competing moral codes and develop morals that are created consciously and reasonably without having to suppress our emotions entirely. These will become more and more useful codes for us that will better decrease more people's suffering more often. It will also provide more pleasure, happiness, love, satisfaction, and joy to more of us more of the time. We can create more sophisticated cross cultural methods of treating ourselves and others this way. But in order to do this, we have to drop the concept of moral absolutes. So, cognitive socially, we abandon moral absolutism as false, but emotionally, we have to allow ourselves to feel it is real. This has survival value because once we come to an agreement on a moral principle, our emotions get behind them and feel them. We couldn't run to a burning car to rescue its occupants if the emotions weren't there to drive us. We couldn't work for hours to provide food for our children if there weren't powerful emotions backing that up. Now, Jim, you might say, how can running to save people from a burning car increase my survival value? And I would say because of two reasons. One, if you do survive, you are more likely to earn preferential treatment from the community. You are more likely to become protected and provided for by the group, and you might be more likely to get laid. Two, odds are that you'll be protecting someone who is part of your in group, which often means someone with a similar genetic code as you. With natural selecting, it's genes that get to survive and replicate, not people. You don't have to reproduce to get genes identical to yours to reproduce. A caveat about this: the goal of evolution does not is not to have genes reproduce. Evolution has no goal. It just so happens that genes they don't survive long enough to replicate themselves eventually. Genes that don't have long enough to replicate or don't survive long enough to replicate themselves just eventually fade away or become very uncommon, while those that do survive long enough to replicate themselves via their host continue on. The traits expressed by genes support or fail to support the replication of those genes in a given organism and environment. So it really is a mindless, thoughtless process. Evolution, though not random, is a sloppy, thoughtless process. Excuse me. This brings me to the fact that our emotions and the beliefs associated with them can go haywire, so to speak. They can get us to do the opposite of what is called for in any given situation because of the complexity of our drive systems. Guilt is a good example of this. The feeling of guilt contains an awful lot of fear. Fear protects us from harm, but it doesn't always do this by getting us to do the right thing. It also it also does this by getting us to cover up our misdeeds that can have survival value. Our emotional systems are always trying to lead us towards some action. It can't be otherwise, even if that action is freezing in place. However, we can pause and doubt the commands that our moral drives are giving us because sometimes they are wrong. We can cause ourselves to doubt our beliefs and expectations too because sometimes they are wrong. And now that we are a worldwide earth crowding species, we must start consciously formulating worldwide ethical agreements because there is no other one than us to decide what is actually right and wrong. There's no one else beside us to decide what's right and wrong. Now, I want to talk about war and the concept of moral injury. The concept of moral injury is most commonly discussed in the context of war. Put simply, we know it's wrong to kill innocent people. We know it's wrong to torture them. There are many other things we know are wrong. Yet in war, we do them. We do them for several reasons. One is that we are permitted legally to do some of these things in war. Another reason is that we sometimes create a rule for ourselves that the only goal of our combat time is to get out. And I know people who had to create that rule to get out alive, whatever it takes. So we also do this new kind of morality in combat because of the ambiguity. For example, in combat situations, we don't always know which people are innocent. We don't know which ones are non-combatants. Another reason is that our emotions shape our lives in combat situations. Trauma happens in combat, and trauma responses make us numb and impulsive. Therefore, we commit evil acts without being able to have any feelings about it. Acts that we know are evil outside of the context of combat. Disclaimer here, I realize there is no such thing as objective good or evil, even though I just used the words good or evil. Also, we may have not developed any sympathy or empathy for the people who are in the group with which we are battling, interacting with in war. We are not bonded with them by familiarity or common culture or other things that bond us. This potential for atrocity has potential survival value, so morality again is functionally subjective. However, breaking deeply embedded moral rules becomes injurious to ourselves when we leave the combat context, even within the combat context to some degree. It destroys our idea of who we are. Our identity comes into question. Doubting our own identity is similar to doubting our existence, emotionally speaking. We don't know who we are, so are we anybody? This, combined with the emotional haywire of numbness and trauma, can make life seem unworthy of perpetuating. Why bother struggling to live when life is so awful, when feelings and emotions are almost always uncomfortable or non existent? When I've broken every rule. See how your moral code can have survival context for you in one context, survival value for you in one context and become life threatening in another? These questions can begin to be answered by the acknowledgement that morals are subjective and situational, but that we have to reformulate our morals to match our needs and the needs of others. Our neurology won't allow us to move on until we find a moral map that matches our experience of having been the bad guy. This is why it is so important to understand that morality is made up, but that it functions within our biology as absolute. We humans have the ability to understand that morality is both real and not real, fake and not fake. Our lives and our loves depend on recognizing this. So when we send someone to do the dirty work on the battlefield, we better be prepared to help heal them when they return. And when we send everyday people and others, ourselves and others, out into the world to earn a living for ourselves and others, the world is hard, so we better be ready to provide maximal support and compensation through our group as a whole to our citizenry. Now, I want to talk about compassion very briefly. It's another emotion that's very important. You know what it is. So, compassion is an emotion. It may be pleasurable or unpleasurable. Many emotions do not fit conveniently only on one side of the pleasure line, but compassion gets us to do a lot of things that are good for ourselves and others. The feeling of compassion carries the component of your desire to relieve suffering of someone else. That relief can be quite pleasurable, even profoundly sometimes. So, what a beautiful thing to wish to provide another human being. Compassion has a function, and it's a form of pleasure for us too, sometimes. Antisocial personality disorder and enlightened self interest. Deep breath. I don't know if you've ever heard of antisocial personality disorder. I first heard of the concept of enlightened self interest more than a decade ago. It was described as the state of the art for treating mental health patients whom many people would call evil. A milder yet still stigmatizing adjective would be scary, and some people even think of these people as inhuman. The people I'm talking about are diagnosed or are diagnosable with what is called antisocial personality disorder. Colloquially, many people call them psychopaths or sociopaths. The problem with all these terms and characterization is that these are actually human beings dealing with a specific kind of disability. Someone has to try to help them solve their problem because helping them with this problem helps us. That's where mental health professionals come in, and that's where enlightened self interest comes in. Because people diagnosed with ASPD have difficulty experiencing empathy and compassion, they therefore may not have the emotional fuel within them to feel strongly that there is an objective moral structure. Like I said before, even though there is no objective moral structure, some of the most beneficial human tasks, including those which feel like sacrifice, would not occur to us. We would never do them. Nevertheless, for the sake of the rest of us and for their own sakes, people with ASPD need a method of doing what is considered right and refraining from behavior that is considered wrong. People with ASPD would be more safe for us and more successful for themselves if they could more automatically line themselves up with the larger moral ethos of our society. Enlightened self interest is the concept that if you serve others the right way, it will serve your interests. The idea is you can satisfy your own selfish urges best by legitimately providing for the needs of others. Why provide legitimately? Why provide legitimately for the needs for people's needs instead of just giving them the shaft and then leaving the scene? One reason could be that building better relationships has more payoffs, emotional, financial, and tangible, than just hit and run. Furthermore, though people with ASPD cannot feel some of the social emotions, they may be able to feel some of the others and even learn to feel the ones that they do not yet experience. As Lisa Feldman Barrett explains, no emotion is innate to some specific neurology. Various neurological patterns combined with a shared language for an experience is what creates emotions. That means the feeling of anger doesn't have just one neurological pattern, it has many. When two people agree that it's anger, then it's anger. So even with different neurology, it's possible to teach some people a sense of bonding through their interactions with others. The nervous system is constantly trying to adapt to its outside experiences. The training of how to get along with other human beings can encourage that adaptation in a particular direction, possibly potentiating the growth of social emotionality. Perhaps even something one could call empathy or compassion. Why would feeling these feelings be better for a person with ASPD than just doing what's right from their cognitive reasoning perspective in order to calculatedly get what they want in return? It's because emotions are faster than reasoning. It's like juggling. You could never really juggle if you are constantly telling each hand consciously, throw, catch, throw, catch, throw, catch. But after a lot of practice, mistakes, and successes, your feelings and muscle memory take over. Very loosely speaking, enlightened self interest takes over as an automatic habit. That's why we should be teaching everyone that morality is subjective, but as good as objective. This allows them rationally to work out what is really good for people, what is really good for others in terms of alleviating suffering and optimizing pleasure, and what is good for us on those same terms. If they know how to do these calculations, they can practice them until they become automatic feelings and behaviors. Moral subjectivity thinking plus practice creates a sense of objective morality, but still leaves us capable of examining our moral code and updating it as we learn more from life experiences and deeply rational. Create objectivity, but remember subjectivity so you can continue developing a better moral code. Now, you might say, Jim, if you explain to all these people with ASPD how to use enlightened self interest, you might just make them more sophisticated swindlers and users. You might be right. That's why I'm trying to teach you. Most hardcore swindlers are probably not even going to stop and think about these things. They just keep going and going. Most socially responsible people are probably not going to stop and think about this transactional version of morality either. So, if we stop the swindlers and teach them, it at least gives them the opportunity to become better participants in our citizenry. Perhaps more importantly, teaching you this could make you less of a sucker. That's right. I believe that you are enabling the swindlers by acting like suckers unless you start to consider making a morality that really works for you. Meanwhile, professionals can help to teach swindlers that their swindling isn't really working for them. So, there. So, it's time for my conclusion. So, how am I going to make use of the knowledge that morality is subjective personally? For me, I'm going to use it to promote my morality as clearly and loudly as I can. So, please subscribe. At the same time, I'm going to have good, honest, thoughtful discussions and debates with other thoughtful people and even with some so called thoughtless people. In order to really fashion a working morality, it requires me to talk to people with whom I disagree and to let the best arguments win. But this process never ends. This is something we make a lifetime of, updating our morality as we update our understanding of the facts of the world and the species in it. We change our view of right and wrong, sometimes ever so slightly, sometimes all at once. Thank you for listening. And I'll ask you one more time to subscribe. And I guess comments and likes are nice too. Hallelujah. There it is.